This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 890 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. You've had a 3-week break from these early week late round podcast episodes, and I'm so glad to be back in your ears. The late round draft guide, it's out there. It's done. It launched on July 1st, and I know a lot of you have already read it and given me feedback, which I greatly appreciate. If you haven't gotten that draft guide, there's still plenty of time to do so. You can head to lateround.com and purchase it for $24.99. You get over 200 pages of information in it, and about 80% of that information is strategy and game theory focused. The remaining 20% gets updated each week. That 20% includes players to target, players to avoid, and late round dart throws, as well as my rankings. And if you didn't take advantage of the Underdog offer before, you can still do that too. If you sign up on Underdog Fantasy with promo code LATEROUND and then make a deposit, Underdog will email you a copy of the guide. That's a $25 value to just play some best ball, or maybe a little pick'em. You get a nice deposit offer when you sign up too. So that's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. Make a deposit and you'll get a draft guide for absolutely free via email, along with a deposit bonus. Now, today's episode isn't about me just letting you know about these offers and where to get the draft guide. So let's shift our focus. I'm a big fan of analyzing market trends in fantasy football, the market being average draft position. Some people think it isn't a worthwhile thing to do, but I have the opposite belief. Not only can it shape the way you approach a draft strategically, but the wisdom of the crowd idea isn't wrong. It assumes that large crowds are collectively smarter than individual experts. A group's collective knowledge leads to better decision-making and problem-solving. Now, I don't think average draft position is flawless. I know it isn't. And I do think that you, as an analyst, as a player, you can be better than ADP. We see bad picks by ADP all the time. But at a baseline, ADP probably isn't as bad as you think, especially on certain platforms and on certain sites. And if you think that it's atrocious, if you think that we can't learn a thing from average draft position, then you may be overconfident in your own abilities. Now, regardless of all of that, one of the reasons I like analyzing the market is because in a game where there's so much unpredictability, we need to find sources of predictable behavior. We need to find things that we can feel confident are going to happen year in and year out. And then we can work off of those things. For example, mobile quarterbacks. Quarterback has become a lot more predictable in fantasy football over the last 5 years, and it's largely because of rushing. Mobile quarterbacks are more predictable. We know who the mobile quarterbacks are going to be going into a given season. And since they're the ones scoring a lot of fantasy points now because they're good passers as well, we now have a better feeling about the quarterbacks at the top of our rankings, like Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson. 10 years ago, we didn't have that type of predictability. And knowing that information means that we can attack our drafts more accurately. But predictability isn't just something that we need to worry about with players or with positions. We can also look at human behavior, our opponent's behavior, and extract value in our fantasy drafts that way. Year in and year out, fantasy drafts kind of go the same way, but not totally. We know that running backs and wide receivers will get drafted early based on supply and demand. And then we'll get some earlier round quarterbacks and some tight ends sprinkled in there too. But there are small things that do shift from one year to the next. Maybe the first and second rounds will be a little bit more wide receiver heavy. Maybe the top couple of quarterbacks fall off boards in round 4 instead of round 2. Stuff like that does fluctuate from one year to the next. And usually when that kind of thing happens, it predictably happens. 2015 was a rough year at running back. When you look at the correlation between top 48, top 24, and top 12 running backs by ADP versus how many points they actually ended up scoring that year, they had the worst season of any year since 2014. Meaning we weren't very good at projecting which running backs were going to perform well. And all this ADP data today is courtesy of fantasydata.com. That lack of predictability at running back in 2015, it showed up in how well the top running backs ended up outscoring the rest of the position as well. In the draft guide, I've got a table that shows each position by year since 2014. And it shows the average points per game difference between the top part of a position to a replacement group of players at that same position. So the top 6 running backs, their average points per game versus the RB 19 to RB 24. And for the record, this is by actual performance, not ADP. So the top 24 running backs by how many points they actually scored. It's the top quarter among the top 24 running backs versus the bottom quarter. It's just a quick way of looking at how valuable the top players were at a position in a given year. 2015 was the worst year for running backs. That's across the last 10 seasons of fantasy football. The top 6 of the position at the end of the season were 5.3 PPR points per game better than the RB 19 to RB 24. That was by far the lowest that we've seen since 2014. So number 1, we were bad at projecting which running backs were going to be good that year. But then number 2, of the running backs who were actually good, they weren't giving fantasy managers that big of an edge. You know what happened in 2016, the following year? That's right. Running back average draft positions dropped. The RB12 in 2016 fell off draft boards at pick 31. The year prior to that, it was 24th overall. Over the last 10 years, when you remove that 2016 season and you look at all of the other seasons, the RB12 had an average overall ADP of 20. That's 11 spots higher than what we saw in 2016. You can do the same exercise for almost any running back spot. Running backs were drafted later in 2016 as a complete and total reaction to a bad season for running backs in 2015. This isn't some uncommon occurrence in fantasy football. And most of the time, we do see bounce backs. There hasn't been a position where there's been a general trend downward with our predictability. And there hasn't been a position in fantasy football where there's been a general trend downward with how the best players are performing against the worst hypothetical starters at those positions. To put that another way, a bad season for a position, it happens. But there's almost always some sort of bounce back. It's usually not nearly as bad as it was the previous season. And we can obviously use that to our advantage. Because if people are going to react at a high level, at a positional level, to what happened the previous season, then there's a chance that if we don't heavily react, we might be able to find some value. This exact same scenario happened just last year, just in the opposite way. In 2022, we saw quarterbacks dominate fantasy football. The high-end quarterbacks were so good versus everyone else. The group of 3 quarterbacks at the top outscored the QB10 to QB12 by 7.4 points per game. No other season was higher than 5.5 within that little metric since 2014. Last year, that 7.4 point advantage turned into a 3.9 point one. And now we're seeing slightly lower costs at quarterback than we did a year ago. But the one place where I think that we can probably take advantage of this most here in 2024 is with tight ends. My stance on elite tight ends through the years has been to either go big or don't worry about the position at all. Not that I think that you can easily stream the position. That's not an easy thing to do. But there's really not a huge difference in ceiling outcome between players you can get in the last rounds versus tight ends that high-end tight end 2 range, maybe even low-end tight end 1 range. This year, I think it's far more advantageous to get an elite tight end or a higher-end tight end. And there are some reasons for that outlined in the draft guide that I won't get into today. Reasons like what's going on at running back, for example. The opportunity cost equation is shifting a little bit. But focusing solely on tight ends, one of the main reasons that I'm going to be leaning on some of these higher end tight ends this year is because of how the market is reacting to 2023. You see, tight end wasn't very good last year. Let's do the same exercise as before. We'll look at top 3 tight ends and compare them to bottom 3 tight ends within the top 12. So tight end 1 to tight end 3, their average points per game versus tight end 10 to tight end 12 and their average. Last year, those top tight ends saw 4.4 PPR point per game advantage. That was the second lowest that we've seen since 2016. And guess what's happening this year? Tight end prices are falling. The tight end 1 from 2014 to 2023 on average was drafted 14th overall. This is for regular PPR leagues. This is not for tight end premium leagues. This year, according to Fantasy Pros consensus rankings, the top tight end is being ranked 27th overall. When looking at the top 8 tight ends this year, they're almost all going later than they have in previous seasons. So the tight end 1 is going later than the typical tight end 1 has gone. The tight end 2 later than the tight end 2 historically, and then so on. And this isn't just by 1 or 2 spots. Some are being ranked and being drafted a full round later. We've seen this happen in best ball drafts too. I've brought this up on Becoming a Best Ball Bro countless times, but the higher end tight ends are getting drafted later than they typically get drafted. Now, some will say this is just the result of Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews going later, that they're the ones skewing perception. But according to ADP and comparing that data to how players are being ranked, it's not just because of those tight ends. Because it's not just the top 2 spots going later in the draft. It's the top 8 spots. And it's no coincidence that this is happening a year after the tight end position just completely burned people. Travis Kelce, by his standards, had a down year. Darren Waller flopped. Dallas Goedert, Kyle Pitts, they weren't anything special. And then all the while, we had this influx of rookies with Laporta and Kincaid, and then Trey McBride and Jake Ferguson, they had big seasons. They were all later round picks who did well. It was the perfect storm for a bad tight end season, at least by ADP. Now, to be fair, you could argue that if there are more tight ends that look like they could be usable, there's less of a need to go after one of those tight ends, right? Like if there were 12 very good tight ends out there in fantasy football, why would you go out and reach for a tight end in your 12-team league draft? Maybe that's why these guys are being pushed down. Because in that scenario, everyone would get a tight end, hypothetically. But there's not necessarily 12 of them. And history has shown us that there won't be some giant tier of 12 guys at the top, or even 7 or 8 guys. Some may say that Travis Kelce's done, or that Mark Andrews is coming off an injury, we should be afraid. But historically, we've still seen by far the best hit rates at tight end when looking at the top 3 or top 4 players at the position by ADP. Like by far. In the draft guide, I've got a table that displays hit rates by tight end ADP grouping since 2014. I took the tight end 1 to the tight end 3 by ADP, I grouped them together, and I showed how frequently they scored 10, 12, and 14 PPR points per game. Then I did the same thing with tight end 4 to tight end 6 and so on, all the way to tight end 18. And because I knew that 2 tight ends in particular, Rob Gronkowski and Travis Kelce, would likely skew this data, I removed them from the data set. And you know what the data showed? It still showed that the top 3 tight ends by ADP were so significantly better in hit rate than any other subset. Tight end 4 to tight end 6, they were pretty strong too. But there was a clear divide from that first group to the second group, and then that second group to the rest of the position. What's really glaring about that data is that the tight end 7 to tight end 8 to tight end 9, that group, they really haven't been that much better than guys who are ranked like tight end 16, tight end 17 by ADP. But think about what this means. Even without Kelce and Gronkowski in our data set, top tight ends are hitting at a wildly good rate. It goes back to my go big or don't draft one at all strategy. It's fine to get an early round tight end because they've been good in the past. Even the guys not named Kelce or Gronkowski. But if you don't get them, you probably should wait. But those guys are usually drafted in the first couple of rounds, the first 3 rounds. Now you're seeing them in round 4 and round 5. The cost to acquire used to be a lot greater. Now, if you're drafting this season based on last year's results, then you'd be under the impression that this data isn't as relevant. That top tight ends nowadays just aren't giving you the same type of edge. Because that's what we saw last season. But I'd argue that that's not totally rational. You'd be basing things off of one season versus many seasons. And yeah, the tight end landscape might look a little different this year than years past. Maybe the top 3 tight ends are slightly worse, and the next 3 tight ends, the tight end 4 to the tight end 6, maybe they're a little bit better than the type of tight ends that we typically see there. But remember, all of these tight ends this year are generally getting drafted later than what we've typically seen. It's not just a Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews problem. It's the majority of these top 6, top 8 tight ends. There's no doubt in my mind that the market is reacting heavily to a weird tight end season in 2023. And while it's not a guarantee that the position bounces back at the top, it seems like a pretty good bet that a few of these tight ends, whether that's Kelce or Laporta or Andrews or Kincaid or McBride, a few of them probably will be giving your fantasy teams a significant edge this year. because they have time and time again throughout history. And now they're cheaper to acquire. We see this kind of thing happen a lot in the fantasy football market, and I do my best to highlight those things each year in the draft guide. And on this podcast, we talked about the quarterback position regressing on the show this time last year. But this year, I think it mathematically makes sense to believe that tight ends will have a bounce back year. And the market isn't totally accounting for that. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. I've got a Becoming a Best Ball Bro episode dropping tomorrow, so be ready for that. And then this is a Late Round Perspectives week, so I'll be getting that to you guys on Friday. Oh, and make sure you're subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel. I'm going to be picking things up and doing more live streams over there, so make sure you're subscribed so you get notified when I'm live. That's youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening. I'll be back tomorrow.